Thank you for having me. This research is actually a spin-off of my ongoing dissertation, focusing on the contemporary crisis of subjectivity and different modes of existence. So I think there will be several overlaps with the previous presentations, but hopefully also some meaningful connections. In autumn 1774, Marie Antoinette's menagerie received Brazilian parrots and Chinese nightingales housed in gilded aviaries. Today, AI-powered pet cameras monitor domestic animals through algorithmic systems marketed as enhanced welfare. Between these moments lie 3 centuries of technological transformation, yet remarkable structural persistence. This presentation examines the cage as what Michel Foucault termed a dispositif, a heterogeneous apparatus comprising material objects, discursive formations, institutional arrangements, and regulatory practices that organize power, knowledge, and desire. My argument is that the cage does not merely contain animals, but actively produces spatial relations, social distinctions, and interspecies hierarchies, while naturalizing these arrangements through aesthetic form. Understanding this requires moving beyond functionalist accounts towards examining how cages mediate relationships amongst human subjects and animals, and between domestic interiors and the broader worlds of nature, empire, science, and commerce. Foucault defines the dispositif as a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. Crucially, the dispositif is not a network of pre-existing elements, but an apparatus that actively organizes subjects and produces power relations. The cage operates as precisely such an apparatus, connecting taxonomic discourse to imperial specimen collection networks, daily care practices to gender ideologies, architectural interior design to biopower's management of life itself. What distinguishes this approach from traditional material culture studies is attention to how the cage functions not as a reflection of social relations, but as their active production. The cage creates the keeper and the kept, the observer and the observed, the cultivated subject and the wild object. It generates specific forms of knowledge about animal life, while simultaneously determining what kinds of knowledge become possible or valued. It channels a desire for mastery over nature, aesthetic refinement, interspecies connection, into specific material and social configurations. Understanding the cage as dispositif reveals how domestic objects participate in what Foucault further identified as the emergence of biopower in the modern period, the proliferation of technologies for managing, optimizing, and disciplining life itself. The cage occupies an irreducibly paradoxical position. It's simultaneously protective enclosure and display mechanism, technology of care and instrument of violence, space of intimacy, and site of absolute dominion. This is not a contradiction requiring resolution, but rather a constitutive tension that demands theoretical attention. The cage establishes zones of extraordinary or wondrous space, thresholds between the familiar and the foreign, the controllable and the wild. As such, the cage is essentially a framing device. It challenges viewing conventions while marking zones of difference within domestic space. This threshold function operates not only at the level of physical containment, but extends into symbolic and affective registers. The question is deceptively simple. What cultural work does the cage perform? Answering requires interrogating how these objects participate in what Bourdieu identified as fields of cultural capital, what Goffman theorized as dramaturgical performances, and what Berger recognized as the modern production of animals as objects of nostalgic contemplation. The cage makes visible the apparatus through which bourgeois domesticity organized its relationship to non-human nature, an apparatus that persists beneath contemporary technological mediation. The dispositif thus extends beyond the cage itself to organize the entire interior around practices of display, surveillance, and distinction. Space becomes stratified, zones of human movement or of animal containment, areas of public display or of private care, masculine spaces of aesthetic appreciation, or feminine spaces of maintenance labor. The cage produces spatial hierarchies that naturalize broader social hierarchies. A series of case studies, Japanese cricket cages, European bird cages, and Victorian aquaria, will show how a genealogy can be traced from the cage containing life to the automaton simulating it, to the algorithm optimizing it. Each stage intensifies the reduction of organic vitality to predictable, manageable, infinitely reproducible mechanisms. Crucially, this genealogy has turned back upon its makers. The cage has become ubiquitous and invisible, collapsing the distinction between interior and exterior that define domestic space. Japanese cricket cages of the Edo period, typically hollow gourds, woven bamboo cylinders, or carved wooden boxes, operated within the aesthetic principle of shuko, miniaturization and compressed representation. These objects contained not only insects, but entire seasonal worlds, participating in practices of mushikiki, insect listening, that paralleled the formalized aesthetics of tea ceremony and ikebana. The cricket cage functioned as a dispositif through multiple registers simultaneously. First, materially and acoustically, craftsmen discovered that different materials produced distinct sonic properties. The cage operated as a musical instrument, amplifying and modulating the cricket's stridulation. This reveals the transformation of species-specific communication into detached aesthetic stimulus for human consumption. The cricket's reproductive and territorial behaviors are severed from their ecological function and reconstituted as pure sound object. Second, economically and institutionally, insect sellers formed a distinct commercial class, capturing crickets in rural areas and transporting them to urban markets. This trade required specialized knowledge constituting cultural capital, knowing which species produced valued songs, optimal capture timing, maintenance techniques. The division between acquisition and appreciation replicated class hierarchies, with merchants profiting from knowledge unavailable to aristocratic consumers. And third, spatially and temporally, cricket cages occupied the tokonoma alcove, the most prestigious position in Japanese domestic architecture. This placed the caged insect within established hierarchies of aesthetic judgment. The tokonoma functioned as what Lefebvre would call representational space, space directly lived through associated images and symbols. Placed there, the insect was transformed into a symbol of seasonal awareness and aesthetic cultivation, its material presence subordinated to its semiotic function. Unlike Western practices emphasizing permanence, cricket keeping structured itself around ephemerality. The insects lived only weeks, making this practice fundamentally about loss and seasonal transition. The cricket cage thus frames not just space but time itself, containing a living memento mori that performs its own elegy. And finally, we must also attend to what Goffman termed backstage realities, rendered invisible by aesthetic framing. The cricket's own experience of captivity remains inaccessible, hidden behind the frame that constitutes it as a contemplative object rather than an experiencing subject. If Japanese cricket cages miniaturized nature into intimate aesthetic experience, European bird cages of the 18th century monumentalized it into public spectacle. These structures, often 6 feet tall on elaborate stands, constructed in brass wirework with neoclassical columns, claimed a vertical space within domestic interiors, organizing social activity around their placement. The architectural vocabulary is significant. These cages echoed cathedral, palaces, pagodas, translating religious and political authority into domestic form. The bird themselves materialized imperial power. Every parrot represented symbolic imperialism, the performance of dominion over distant territories through captive bodies. These were nodes in global networks connecting metropolitan centers to colonial peripheries. Archival evidence revealed the infrastructure required and the predominantly working class feminized labor that sustained elite collecting, labor systematically erased in period visual representations, emphasizing aristocratic leisure and refinement. French aristocratic salons arranged furniture to orient towards elaborate aviaries, making the cage a focal point for social gathering. This spatial organization structured patterns of movement and interaction, creating what Goffman termed front regions, where social performances could unfold around the spectacle of exotic animals. The cage functioned as what de Certeau might call a spatial story, an object around which narrative and social meaning accumulated. Gender also operated through complex and contradictory logics. Literature prescribed bird care as an appropriate feminine occupation, connecting to broader ideologies associating women with nature, domesticity, and decorative refinement. The cage functioned as a technology for producing bourgeois femininity, yet women themselves frequently recognized and resisted this parallel, writing with acute awareness of the correspondence between avian and female captivity. This contradiction illuminates how dispositifs create not through simple domination, but through complex negotiations where subjects are simultaneously complicit in and resistant to the power relations they inhabit. The cage produces cruel optimism, the attachment to objects and practices that actively undermine flourishing yet remain difficult to relinquish because they organize identity, social position, and affective life. And the Victorian aquarium introduced a fundamentally new relationship between viewer and captive, organized around the illusion of transparent immediacy. Unlike traditional cages with bars and mesh that acknowledged their barrier function, the aquarium promised unmediated access, a window onto underwater worlds as if the viewer were submerged alongside the fish. This transparency, however, was anything but natural. Creating a balanced aquarium required sophisticated understanding of biological and chemical processes, as we've seen. The apparently spontaneous ecosystem, visible through glass, was in fact an intensively managed artificial environment, its balance maintained through constant intervention. And this exemplifies what Foucault identified as biopower, the management of life itself through technologies of regulation and optimization. The domestic aquarium's material forms encoded ideological commitments. Gothic revival tanks and neoclassical models with pediments and columns, Orientalist designs incorporating bamboo and lacquer. These decorative elements position the aquarium simultaneously as a scientific instrument and a piece of furniture, naturalizing its presence within the domestic interior by assimilating it to established aesthetic codes. Victorian parlors positioned the aquariums to maximize natural light while ensuring visibility from primary seating areas. The aquarium table became a secondary hearth, an alternative focal point, particularly for feminine sociability and children's education. The most elaborate examples featured ornate cast iron stands and carefully composed scenes that transformed marine life into living dioramas. This scenographic approach anticipates what Haraway would later critique as nature cultures, supposedly natural arrangements that are thoroughly cultural productions. Discourse surrounding aquariums reveal complex negotiations between scientific and sentimental registers. Written accounts are balanced between rigorous natural history observation and rapturous aesthetic appreciation, describing marine creatures in language moving from taxonomic precision to romantic wonder. This dual framework allowed the aquarium to serve multiple functions simultaneously: a rational instrument for studying nature, a source of aesthetic pleasure, and vehicle for moral instruction. Children figured prominently in this discourse, with the tanked position as an educational tool, instilling both scientific knowledge and gentle sentiment, training young bourgeois subjects in techniques of rational management undergirding both domestic and imperial order. This historical evolution is entangled with a parallel genealogy, that of mechanical automata seeking to replicate living beings without actual captivity's unpredictability, mortality, and ethical complications. Vaucanson's digesting duck marks a crucial threshold. This gilded copper automaton appeared to eat grain, metabolize it, and excrete waste. Beyond simulating external behavior, Vaucanson attempted to reproduce internal biological processes through elaborate hidden mechanisms. Though it employed chemicals, the device gestured toward the fantasy of complete biological replication. The automaton served an illogical function. It naturalized a Cartesian mechanistic worldview, denying animal subjectivity precisely when European culture was massively expanding animal captivity practices. If animals were machines, then building mechanical animals demonstrated understandings of vital processes while rendering living animals ontologically redundant. And this genealogy extends all the way to the present time, with contemporary smart pet enclosures revealing the persistence and technological intensification of cage logics that might appear superseded by digital innovation. Virtual pets from Tamagotchi to smartphone apps offer simulated companionship without living animals' demands. The Tamagotchi's threatened death creates effective investments while remaining purely symbolic. Always resettable, the pet is resurrected without consequence. Products and systems with app-controlled feeding, lighting, and filtration exemplify what I would argue is not the transcendence of historical practices, but their algorithmic reinscription. These devices promise enhanced animal welfare through data-driven care while maintaining, indeed expanding, the fundamental surveillance structures analyzed by Foucault. These technologies operate within surveillance capitalism, economic formations where data extraction and behavioral modification become core profit-generating mechanisms. The smart cage generates continuous streams of data flowing not only to pet owners, but to corporate servers where information can be aggregated, analyzed, and monetized. The animal is a data double, a digital representation that can be tracked, predicted, optimized according to algorithmic logics. This represents what Stiegler identified as grammatization, the discretization of continuous processes into manipulable data points. Marketing discourse emphasizes care, connection, welfare. Owners can check in remotely, ensure scheduled feeding, receive behavioral alerts. Yet this apparent concern operates through intensified surveillance, subjecting animal life to unprecedented visibility and measurement. The promise of algorithmic optimization represents biopower's extension into computational realms. These systems claim to transcend human error and inconsistency, offering perfectly calibrated environments managed by data-driven decision-making. Yet this technology-mediated care still operates within the fundamental structure of the cage, total control over another being's existence justified through welfare logic. The algorithmic black box simply obscures rather than transforms the power relations. Understanding the cage as dispositif requires confronting what I term the affective paradox. The same apparatus functions simultaneously as an instrument of violence and expression of care, a mechanism of control, and a channel for genuine attachment. This is not a contradiction requiring resolution, but a constitutive tension. The keeper's affection operates within structures of absolute dominion. They determine every aspect of the captive's existence: diet, space, temperature, lighting. This is precisely what Foucault termed pastoral power, authority exercised through care, where the shepherd's love for the flock depends upon and reinforces hierarchical control. Crucially, Foucault traces pastoral power's historical transformation. Where Christian pastorship concerned itself with individual souls' salvation, modern pastoral power extends to populations' biological optimization. Health, productivity, welfare become governmental concerns requiring continuous intervention into life processes. This analytical framework allows us to hold in tension the reality that keepers genuinely love their animals while simultaneously exercising violence upon them. The cage makes this visible because it materially embodies the paradox. Contemporary smart pet enclosures represent the convergence of cage genealogy with digital surveillance capitalism and the automaton's computational extension. The continuous data streams generated by smart devices flow directly to corporate servers, where it's aggregated, analyzed, and monetized. Here we witness the crucial transition from Foucault's biopower to what Deleuze terms societies of control. While disciplinary societies operated through enclosures, schools, factories, prisons, hospitals, Deleuze identifies a fundamental shift in late capitalism, the replacement of distinct enclosures with continuous modulation. Bentham's panopticon assumed constant visibility would produce self-regulation in human subjects aware of being watched. The smart cage extends panoptic logic to creatures incapable of such self-awareness, creating a post-panoptic condition where surveillance operates purely as external control rather than internalized discipline. This is biopower without the normalizing dimension Foucault identified in human institutional settings. Raw management of life without the productive effect of self-surveillance. More fundamentally, it represents control society's characteristic operation, not periodic inspection, but continuous monitoring, not fixed standards, but algorithmic optimization, not confinement within walls, but tracking across spaces. I'll conclude with the most profound transformation. The cage has become ubiquitous and miniaturized to the point of invisibility. In postmodernity and the digital age, the distinction between interior and exterior has collapsed. The cage is no longer a discrete enclosure within domestic space, but the organizing logic of space itself. Smartphones track our movements continuously, social media platforms capture and commodify our behaviors, algorithmic systems optimize our desires and predict our actions. We carry the cage with us, embedded in the devices mediating our relationships. The panopticon has been internalized and digitized, distributed across networks rather than concentrated in architectural forms. This dissolution of the interior-exterior boundary produces what might be called a becoming animal of the subject, not metaphorically, but materially and structurally. Becoming animal is neither imitation nor identification, but the construction of assemblages that traverse both human and animal that make both indiscernible. Sorry. In societies of control, humans increasingly experience the conditions they designed for caged animals. Continuous surveillance, behavioral tracking, life processes rendered as data streams for optimization, existence reduced to algorithmic prediction and management. The keeper has become the kept. This is not to trivialize animal captivity's violence by comparing it to human experience of digital surveillance. Rather, it's to recognize that the dispositifs developed for dominating animals have been turned back upon human populations with intensifying force. The technologies of biopower, developed partly through veterinary and zoological practices, were applied to human populations. Contemporary surveillance technologies often pilot with animals before being adapted to humans. The becoming animal of late capitalist subjects names a real transformation, the extension of control technologies across species boundaries until the distinction between captor and captive, surveiller and surveilled, optimizer and optimized becomes radically unstable. We have built cages so sophisticated, so miniaturized, and so distributed across networks that they have become the architecture of existence itself. No longer enclosures we can step outside of, but conditions we inhabit continuously. What alternatives might interrupt this trajectory? They would require confronting how the cage has turned back upon its makers, how the dispositifs designed for others now structure our own existence. Recognizing this opens space for different strategies of resistance. Not escape, as there is no exterior to flee to, but lines of flight, practices that interrupt established codes, that create deteriorized spaces within control regimes, that refuse optimization imperatives. The cage reveals not only how we have dominated nature, but how we have caged ourselves. The question is whether recognizing this entrapment can generate practices of mutual liberation. Thank you for your attention.